Over 50 years ago, I tried to build Bluenose from a billing kit and failed. I was impressed, however, by the sweeping lines of her hull and have been an admirer of Grand Banks fishing schooners ever since. But I hasten to add, I am no expert on their history. I have Chappell's book, The American Fishing Schooners, which contains some very good line drawings. Searching for a project, I first thought I would have another go at building Bluenose, but this time as a working model. However, this famous schooner has been well modelled and kitted, so I decided I wanted something similar, but for scratch building. I was attracted to the lines of Helen B. Thomas, the first of the knockabouts with an extended forepeak without bowsprit, a useful feature for a working model. But when I came to look at the sail plan, there are many large overhangs in the foresails. It would require a complicated arrangement of servo motors to pull the foresails over in a tack, and I've always tried to keep the operational side of models simple. Simple generally means fewer problems, so for this reason, I decided not to go ahead. Puritan is a much later design with similar appealing lines. From a modeler's point of view, it had a couple of advantages. Less inclined to the rudder post than Helen B. Thomas, which makes for easier rudder servo installation, keeping everything below deck. And even so, as it turned out, the rudder servo installation was difficult. The sail plan was much more to my liking with small overlaps. It would not be possible to include the flying jib since it's sheeted well aft of all the other sails, and it would be difficult to get it to set correctly. I was apprehensive about the narrow beam and whether it could be made sufficiently stiff to perform as a practical working model. The original was built essentially as a racing yacht and was lightly built. I figured my model would have to be similarly lightweight in construction. Puritan was built specifically to compete in the international fishing schooner races against Bluenose, the Canadian vessel that had dominated 2 previous races. After the defeat of Elsie, a smaller vessel which had won the American elimination races in 1921, it was decided that they were ever going to beat Bluenose, a larger, faster design would have to be built. Launched in March 22, the Canadians objected to Puritan entering the race that year, as she had not actually done any fishing. Her career, however, was short-lived, as she became a total loss on only her 3rd voyage by running aground. Consequently, her full potential was never realized. She was certainly fast, and she did make some passages in which she reportedly averaged 15 knots. The internet has several photos of the full size, which proved to be very useful, including the previous slides, which I think must have been taken on launch day in 1922. Here she is under sail, and even with a much reduced sail area, she still makes a pretty sight. My computer expanded the drawings to approximately 1/40th scale, and the model came out at 38.5 inches overall without bowsprit. An unusual scale, but the largest length model I can carry on the back seat of my car. Building commenced by constructing the keel. Here is a photo of the keel laid on the drawings to check accuracy. You can see in the slide that 4 portholes are shown in the cabin sides, which I followed. Later, I was to find out only 3 are on the actual ship. Incorrect drawings perhaps, or did the builder deviate? No substitute for good photography. I only found this out much later when I was studying the photos for information on deck layout, too late to amend. This slide shows a typical frame cut out in thin 2mm thick ply. I like to use this for frames as it doesn't need much sanding of bevels, and because the glue area is so small, they are easily removed as a later stage to allow unimpeded sail controls. The frame here is shown against the fully assembled keel. I found it a rather scary shape. This is the start of assembly on a building board, pre-marked with frame positions and a center line. I like to trap the frames between two battens and not fix until the keel is in place. This allows the frames to be adjusted slightly, should there be errors in the lofting. With all the frames on board, I ran 2 temporary planks as shown to test that the frames were correctly aligned. Despite some very careful measuring and cutting, inevitably I found 1 or 2 which needed some amendment. I have not previously built a model with such an extreme shaped hull, and it took a long time pondering how I would be able to plank it. On previous models, I've started with a garboard plank running the full length of the keel. Quite impossible in this case. I started by planking from the stern post, terminating at the point where the hull curves sharply. Subsequently, planks crept along the keel towards the bow. It seemed to work quite well, and eventually the entire hull was planked. I used 1/8 balsa for the planking, which would subsequently be toughened with fiberglass resins. The 2 downward arrows are indicating holes drilled through the keel, ready for brass tubes to support the ballasting lead keel, as we shall see in later slides. In this slide, the hull has been finished, sanding, and a coat of epoxy fiberglass resin applied. The next stage was to remove the hull from the board. Stretchers were put in to maintain the hull shape when removing the formers. Deck beams will be later installed. You can just see one of the supports in place for a keel tube. The hull interior will have a coat or 2 of hard glass resin before fitting the deck. I like to get the radio gear installed whilst unimpeded by the deck. This is the rudder servo, which I've had to mount at an angle to give a straight pull to the tiller arm. The servo is slightly smaller than standard, and even so, it was a tight squeeze to install. The operating rod is very short, and I've used a universal ball joint to allow free movement. Both the winch and rudder servo need to be installed in a position which can be accessed via the removable cabin. And here the winch servo is being lined up on temporary formers. Ultimately, the sails will be operated by a continuous loop around a bow pulley. The under deck is cut from 1/16 ply and is in 2 pieces as it has a small step. You can see the rudder servo protruding into the cabin area and the sail winch drum below. There is so little space in what is a fairly large hull. Here, deck planking is well underway, and I have used 132 balsa with a permanent marker along an edge to represent caulking. Deck fittings are being applied and the deadeyes are in position. These are 5mm diameter, bound to thin brass strips with fine armature copper wire. The cabin coach roof comfortably covers the rudder servo. The gear wheels for the winch made by cutting edges from a nylon cable tie and thinned down to make the wraparound. The photo was taken before cleaning up. Deposits of my skin are still stuck from the sino. The deck is finished with a coat of matte varnish and is almost ready for masting. I counted the many sail rings from photos and made them up from brass tubing. These are lighter than brass rod, which is a benefit, but they do need some cleaning up at the joint. Fortunately, I had some smaller rings from a deconstructed piece of costume jewellery for the upper masts. The position of the mast needed some working out, as they are at different angles, and I needed a stretcher to hold them in position until fixed. The stretcher was also useful to hold a gaff at the correct angle so that proper patterns could be made for sailmaking to come. I made 2 dories to be mounted on the deck, and that is it. I believe the full size carried 10 on port and starboard sides. However, I decided that 1 would have to be sufficient. And I read that latterly they fished from the mothership, so I'm in a transition situation. The shot shows them in trial position. You can also see a sheet emerging from a plastic tube, which will control the gaff foresail. Forgive me if that's not the correct terminology. For the sails, I boiled a piece of blue Architect's tracing material. After some subsequent rinsing, I've got a very lightweight fabric, perhaps a little widely woven, but this could help the model's stability. It was just a question of being able to sew it. I don't think sewn on bolt ropes would look right for a 1920 schooner, so I experimented with including a glued cord within the folded seams. The pre-glued cord is laid in the fold of an ironed-in crease. The material is then folded over and ironed up to the cord, making sure not to flatten it. The heat of the iron sets the PVA quickly. The sail edges were finally finished with 2 rows of stitching and the surplus material removed. The seaming process worked quite well, and I was then able to finish off by sewing in panel lines. The keel was cast in an old wine box with the support armature wired into position. Because the keel is narrow in width, I have had to use steel rods within the brass tubes to ensure sufficient strength. All is held in place by 2 split pins through the support tubes protruding from the keel. The armature held the suspension rods firmly during casting, and I was able to line up the pre-drilled holes without problems. Here is the finished model, photographed at a Friday night meeting of our Bromley group. This photo was taken on the Hall before launch for its maiden voyage. Always a time of excitement and some apprehension, but it might not be a success or even sink. A view of the bow with painted scrolls and computer printed lettering. The maiden voyage was made in very calm conditions. I was pleased it performed well, and it certainly made an elegant sight on the water. As previously mentioned, Puritan was likely built as a racing yacht, and I have followed the lead in the model, which without keel weighs less than 2 pounds. The keel weighs 6 pounds and is as deep as I can comfortably go for our sailing waters. Good for stability to have such a large mass of the overall weight in the keel. When there was a slight puff of wind, the model gathered pace quickly and I believe it is going to be an exciting model to sail. Since building, there have been few opportunities to sail and fully trim it out. COVID restrictions and an empty pond have prevented further testing. Like the original, but for very different reasons, my Puritan model has yet to show her full potential. And this is a postscript to my original presentation. We did get some water into our pond for a very brief period, and I took the chance to sail Puritan, having made some adjustments to the set of the sails after the maiden voyage. The conditions were again light airs, but there were a few stronger puffs. The photos were all taken during the calm conditions. When the stronger puffs did arrive, the model picked up speed very quickly and was out of shot before I could operate the camera. It's an easily driven model without any vices so far, and it is a joy to sail. I've had a lot of satisfaction seeing this scratch-built project perform well, and personally, I think it makes a very pretty sight on the water. Sail on the 23 season.